Thank you all for joining in for our virtual class today. We will be covering the topics of segmentation and target marketing in this class. We have gone over some of these concepts in our previous lecture, and I will be recapping them again when we meet next Tuesday. You will have about half an hour of a lecture here, and then you should watch the videos that I've assigned. Links for them will be available in your email and also on our Slack channel. So if you have any questions, just feel free to email me. I should have access to email while I'm away. And as for your participation grade for this class, you just have to submit one-line summaries of what you saw in each of the videos assigned or the key message in every video. I might also send you a list of questions that you could answer. So I'll decide on that a little later. All right, so let's get started. Think about the following image on your screen. Do you recognize the show? And if so, think about why you started watching the show. And if you've never watched it, then consider the reasons why you do not like the show. Once you've seen the next following image in your email summary of the video lecture, you will have to state which shows you watch and why not, because that will help us make sense of some of the segmentation issues that we'll be considering today. So the first show here is Modern Family, and it is focused on a certain segment of the market. And you could even say that it's sort of targeted on a mass market audience, but even some of the families that are documented in the show, they are sort of sub-segments of a certain market demographic that they're appealing to. Now, many of you in the class survey that we did earlier mentioned watching shows, like Friends. Now, think about the reasons why you like watching the show. Is it because of nostalgia for a simpler world? Is it because it's funny? How did you even come across watching that show? Did it happen because your other older siblings were watching it or your parents watched it? So think about some of those issues as you go through these slides. Now, interestingly enough, none of you mentioned watching The Big Bang Theory. And it's interesting because this was the show that was meant to replace the gap that was left by the Friends slot. And it has some of the same elements, like the neighbors in close proximity, a group of friends who go through thick and thin together. Why or why not has the show had the same impact as Friends once did? Think about those issues. And then think about this show, The Sopranos. How many of you have watched this one? And if so, why? And then consider Game of Thrones. Some of you mentioned watching it, but think about the reasons again, why did it appeal to you? Why did you, think about how it even happened. Was it a friend who recommended it? Was it just being blasted on television with advertisements for this show? What made you curious about watching it? Or was it science fiction? Or what are the themes in this show that are most attractive? Or Suits, or the show Brooklyn Nine-Nine. There was a person in our class who mentioned watching Mr. Robot. Now consider how we have moved away from shows that were targeted at somewhat mass audiences to shows that are targeted at somewhat more niche audiences. Not everyone would watch Mr. Robot. It appeals to a subculture of consumers who are more into high tech, perhaps. The same with maybe Black Mirror, and not everyone would love it. And so, what I'm trying to show here is how we have sort of shifted from mass audience programming to very segmented and targeting programming. Now, one of the things that has happened over time is that audiences have fragmented quite a bit. New mediums have come up, such as Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, which are providing more targeted on-demand entertainment. Why are they doing this? It's because they can't really target mass audiences. Tastes have evolved too much. Like you guys mentioned, you don't watch TV. Only a few people watch TV. And so, think about what is the difference between mass market versus targeted market. And think about the following brands for a minute: Facebook and Google. Are these mass brands or are they targeted brands? Can they be customized for different consumers? Now, some might argue that they are mass brands, and that might be correct. Everyone uses Google and everyone uses Facebook. Like, most of the people use Facebook. It's even considered like the largest country if you take out the nation-state definition. On the other hand, increasingly what we see on platforms is customization to our own taste, since there are algorithms that trace all of our queries. All of our likes are traced, all of our shares and dislikes are also traced. So these companies can target us very effectively. Now think about WhatsApp versus Telegram. They're both messaging services. Many of you might be more familiar with the WhatsApp logo. Why is WhatsApp more popular than Telegram? Telegram is sort of like a new emerging messaging app, which is sort of more popular among developers, but that's the case with most new technologies. They're most popular among developers, and then they sort of trickle down. But Telegram has a different offering. It's meant to provide stronger encryption of messages, and it's used more heavily in tech circles. Now think about the fact that WeChat is also a huge brand, but it is mainly popular in the Chinese market because most consumers there use it not only to communicate but also to pay for things. So a lot of things are integrated into WeChat compared to other, apps that are out there. Now think about Starbucks. Is that a mass brand or a niche brand? Some of the best brands can often be targeted at mass audiences, but they make you feel like they're just targeting you and only you. And that's often what makes a strong brand. Alright, is Disney a mass brand or a targeted brand? Why or why not? Send me an answer to this via email when you send your one-line summary. In fact, just don't even send me a summary, just send me the answer to whether or not Disney is a mass brand or a targeted brand. And it can be your answer, although I'm going to give you an answer right here. So Disney in some ways has become a more targeted brand. It has branches of its business that cater to different audiences. It owns Pixar, Marvel, and then it has other franchising deals as well. In fact, they say that Disney makes more money from merchandising franchise than it does on its actual movies. So overall, through some of these examples, you can see that companies can either have mass market targets or they can have more segmented targets. And the way we discussed in class, some of you mentioned McDonald's as a mass brand or Coca-Cola as a mass brand because, they appeal to very different people who are out there, or even Walmart. Now, there are 3 steps for target marketing. The first step is market segmentation, where you sort of divide and conquer different parts of the market. You identify the basis for segmenting your market and then develop consumer profiles. For example, if you're on a committee developing a new show on Netflix, you will first have to identify which target market you want to appeal to. The second step is target marketing. In this step, you develop measures of segment attractiveness. For example, would the people actually buy your product even if the product is targeted at them? You can always have examples of products that are well targeted, but then the public just doesn't bite. They don't buy your product. So, and that's how most businesses fail, where you're trying to give a value that no one really wants to partake in. The third step is where you develop your positioning. How will you reach the target markets that you have selected? How would you approach them? For example, think about yourself for a moment. What would be the best way to reach you as a consumer? Would it be on TV or would it be on Facebook or Netflix? Alright, so market segmentation is where you divide up your market. You divide your market based on distinct needs, characteristics, or behavior. For example, Chef's Table on Netflix is a popular show targeted primarily at foodies or aspiring foodies. And, all the Instagrammers out there love it because, it's good food, apparently. Some effective targeting strategies include being able to identify and profile groups of buyers who might buy your product. You have to figure out how to reach them, which is your positioning strategy, and you have to communicate the benefits of your product. This is what your product or services value proposition is. Remember the 4 steps of marketing, like, you create value, you deliver value, you have to communicate your product's value as well. Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can segment your market. You can do this on a geographical basis. You can segment your market on a demographic basis, psychographic, behavioral, or use a combination of methods in segmenting your market. A lot of retail outlets like Zara often have to take into account geographic segmentation. This outlet of Zara, for example, is in a busy area surrounding the Freedom Tower in New York. You won't see too many Zara outlets in the middle of small cities. Why is that? Because, even though they may have segments of the market who might go and buy Zara products, but the segments may not be large enough to sustain a brand like Zara. You might not see it, let's say, in the middle of some Midwestern state of Canada, I don't know, Manitoba maybe, they probably have Zara there. But I hope you get what I'm trying to say. It's like they won't locate in the suburbs, or maybe they might locate in the suburbs if, the suburbs are wealthy enough. I think it happens in Long Island. They have some suburbs which are very wealthy, and so they have their own Zara outlets there. So it's basically these retail outlets, they locate themselves in places where, there's going to be a substantial enough market and purchasing power of the consumers to sustain the brand. Which brings us to the next point. You have to segment the market according to some other variables as well. For example, how much revenue will that segment generate for us? Would it be a profitable venture? For example, these restaurants are growing in New York where people are eating food while blindfolded. But will such consumers be a large enough target market to open up an entire restaurant for? You have to consider whether or not a certain segment matches your overall business strategy. For example, if you're Holt Renfrew, would it make sense for you to have discount outlets targeted at different segments of the market? Now, for those of you who might have once watched Modern Family, there's a character in the show called Manny Delgado. He's 11 years old, or used to be in the first few seasons. He is Colombian American, wears guayaberas, like short sleeve shirts or suits. He likes French press coffee, and remember that he's 11 years old. He likes aftershave. He writes poetry and is an excellent chess player. Now, how would you try and target them? Would demographic segmentation work for this guy? Or even think about, the subculture of bronies, which is a sort of subculture that emerged from My Little Ponies show. It's a group of young men who really like these ponies, and it's a way of expressing masculinity. And how would you target shifting demographics and gender norms which keep changing? So demographic segmentation is often based on variables like age, life cycle, gender, income, generation, like whether you're a millennial, a baby boomer, or social class, race, and culture. However, we sort of live in a postmodern world where many of these boundaries are constantly undergoing change, and these demarcations are shifting. Family life and how people live is changing, and so demographic segmentation is a somewhat outdated way to segment. Then there is geographic segmentation. This is where you segment your market based on where they are located. For example, one of the reasons why Facebook and WhatsApp have not really taken off in China, besides censorship issues, is that WeChat controls that market. Geographically, WeChat is very effective in China. On the other hand, another example of geographic segmentation can be when you have products that cater to a certain part of the world. For example, Canada Goose will not really work too well in humid climates. Uber also has to use geographic segmentation when launching in new cities. They have to consider whether or not the target market would be large enough to sustain the brand. Now, geographic segmentation focuses on dividing up the regions of the world by cities, state, districts, neighborhoods. It is also somewhat limited, as more and more people become, they're living as digital nomads, and they're living in different parts of the world, and borders are increasingly, although in some parts of the world they're going up, they're also becoming more porous in general. It's a very blurred construct. So as with previous cases, often using a mix of segmentation methods is more appropriate. Psychographic segmentation is based on dividing up the market based on factors such as lifestyle, social class, personality-based segmentations, like why would you go to Whole Foods instead of No Frills? Could it be because you value organic produce? Why would you buy Burberry over Zara? Maybe because you like the apparent prestige that comes with Burberry. Why buy Muji over some other shop that has branded products? Maybe because you prefer brands that have no logos on them. And so psychographic segmentation is based on the science of using psychology and demographics to understand consumers. Related to this is sort of the idea of behavioral segmentation. And this is focused on what you actually end up doing. For example, are you one of those who buy a ton of Christmas gifts or not? Do you spend a lot on Halloween, or do you go crazy whenever there is a Valentine's Day coming up? Or if you're in China, do you celebrate Singles Day where you buy a lot of stuff because you're single? It's a huge market that was sort of started by Alibaba. They've made it a huge trend, the whole Singles Day. So behavioral segmentation often focuses on events, it can be religious events, celebrations, all those things. They're based on, just whatever you're going to consume. And then there is the VALS framework, which is basically known as the Values and Lifestyle Framework. In this one, you have a number of factors. For example, if you fall into these various categories, like you can be an innovator, if you're an innovator, then you might be one of those folks who are early adopters. You would rush to the Apple store whenever there's a new phone, or the newest game, or whenever there's a new movie launch, and whenever there's like a new restaurant opening up. Like, think of how many of you were at Uncle Tetsu's launch. If none of you were there, then shame on you. It's a very good... It's not really good. It's not very healthy. But, think about it. If you were one of those people, who sort of line up whenever there's a new restaurant launching in any part of the world, then you're one of the innovators. You're one of the early adopters. Thinkers, on the other hand, are the people who take their time. They think, apparently. And they measure the pros and cons of every decision they take. They'll ask for advice before making any first purchase. Like, if you're in the market for a laptop, or you're planning to buy a camera, you might consult with a lot of people before actually buying the product. Achievers, on the other hand, are those who are trying to communicate something about their consumption to others. Although most consumption is always symbolic, you are always trying to communicate something. For example, getting a fancy Lamborghini or a Tesla in the hopes that, that it makes you look cool. And then there are experiencers who are, this is the market that Instagram and Airbnb run after. In fact, they make up the entire experience economy in some ways. They're the ones who are sort of like the innovators as well. They like trying out new things and new experiences. They spend a lot of money on fashion, entertainment, and socializing. For example, there's a subculture of meat eaters who go to these cities in Italy and like try raw meat, and the ones who try out new coffees all the time. And then there are the conservative people. These are generally older consumers who like trusted brands that they have been using for many years. For example, many people in the US, especially the older demographic, sometimes prefer Under Armour as it is viewed as more of an American brand. Ford and General Motors also benefit from such a dedicated following. Strivers, these are basically hipsters, but not unlike the experiencers. They prefer products that are trendy and fun. Makers, on the other hand, these are people who like value. They appreciate products that deliver what they promise to deliver on. There is actually a growing maker movement in the United States, and even in Canada for a little bit, guys who are into 3D printing, for example, where young people sort of, take apart computers and remake them. A lot of these people are also into, do-it-yourself, and so they like making up their own stuff. And in fact, like if you're aware of the tiny house movement, these people are sort of downshifting and making up their own homes, which are actually just like RV vans pretty much. So those are kind of the maker. That's a profile of someone who's like a maker. And then there are survivors. These are the ones who are just reliable consumers. Many of them might be older and they're brand loyal, and they don't change their consumption practices too frequently. As you can see in this image, some of these categories overlap. You can see that innovators and survivors are at the extremes of the continuum, while there is some overlap between experiencers, achievers, and thinkers. You may also note that these lie on the side where they have high innovation and higher resources, while believers, strivers, and makers might have low innovation and lower resources, although that is not always the case. So, the framework needs some tweaking. Take it with a pinch of salt, like everything else. It is a useful way of thinking about target consumers, but no one method is foolproof or perfect. So overall, once you know your target market, you have to figure out whether or not they know your product or not. If they are aware of your product, then you have to communicate to them what your value proposition is. If they know you, and then you have to figure out whether or not they've tried your product or not. If not, then why? And if they haven't tried your product, then is it because they have a negative opinion of you? For example, if you're Volkswagen, then is it because of the diesel scandal, or are they just neutral consumers who don't care much about your brand? Or do they have a favorable opinion and still haven't tried your product? Think about the Dear Kitten ad that we saw in the first class. Friskies, you might have a positive opinion of Friskies, but you won't really buy it unless you get a cat. Then on the flip side, if people have tried your product, you have to figure out, have they rejected your product after trying it? Let's say you're Air Canada, and did the consumer have a good experience or a bad experience? Did they repeat and buy another flight from you, or switch over to some other airline company? So think about that. And if they have tried your product, then are they loyal and repeat customers, or will they easily switch over to your competitors? And then finally, if they are loyal to your brand, then are they lightweight users or a frequent flyer? So you have to consider these issues when figuring out your target market. And then the next step is figuring out the requirements for effective segmentation. You have to consider the following issues. Is your target market measurable? And can you figure out a way to identify your consumers and how many of them you can target? Do you have enough purchasing power to buy your product? Do they have enough purchasing power to buy your products? And if you're, let's say, Nordstrom or Holt Fruit, then you most likely won't be opening up in the suburbs of Alaska, because the target market may not be enough to sustain your costs. You have to figure out if your target market is differentiable. And by that, what I mean is, for example, if you're a matcha tea company about to launch in Canada, do you have a large enough target market that you can cater to? And is your target market actionable? For example, consider a new brand called Allbirds. It's a shoe company that makes woolen shoes, but it does not have a retail presence in Canada. One of the things that they did, however, was that they started these pop-up stores in Toronto, and they basically allowed people to try out their shoes, and they just maintained their online business now. So doing a pop-up store in Canada allowed them to see whether or not there was enough demand for their products. And now the question is, what is target marketing? Target marketing is essentially evaluating your market segments, whether or not the segment is set to grow or not. For example, Muji in Canada, their target market is growing across the globe as Muji appeals to very different consumer segments. And it's interesting that they are kind of like a mass brand. You know, they serve everything. They're kind of like a department store in some ways, but they're also they are focused in their strategy. And they do appeal more to younger people, although older consumers are also there. You also have to assess issues such as levels of competition in the market. Are there other brands offering the same value? Are there substitute products that are easily available? For example, if you're a Chinese brand of noodles launching in Canada, are there already many competitors in the market? You know, you can go to Chinatown and find dozens of brands selling the same rice noodles. So you have to think about, is the market saturated already, or can you have a differentiated product? You also have to consider the supplier relationships. And last but not the least, think about your company's overarching goals and objectives. Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can target market. You can have an undifferentiated market. For example, toilet paper companies target mass market consumers generally. They have mass marketing campaigns and target consumers very broadly. You might have differentiated marketing, which is, you know, where you segment, where you divide up your market into different segments and then target them. For example, Unilever has a product called Dove targeted at women, while Axe is targeted at men. Concentrated marketing is niche marketing. For example, think back to the television show Mr. Robot. It's an example of targeting a subculture of consumers. And you can also target consumers very narrowly. For example, you could have a local coffee shop that only serves coffee made from locally sourced beans, and it's targeted at a specific local clientele. As we have discussed already, all of these decisions are based on whether or not your company has the resources to target these consumers. For example, Zara owns Massimo Dutti, which targets higher income consumers. H&M similarly owns the high-end label COS, which is targeting higher income consumers, an older demographic compared to its younger demographic, which frequents H&M. Positioning is the place where the product occupies, positioning is basically the place that your product occupies in consumers' minds. For example, LVMH owns these brands, Sephora, Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, etc. I always mess up the watch's name, Tag, whatever it is. In identifying your positioning strategy, you have to think about your possible competitive advantages. For example, if you're Muji or Uniqlo, which synergies do you have? The products and the services, the channels, people and image that occupy in your consumer's mind. You also have, you need to have meaningful differences between all of your offerings. For example, Loblaws owns all of these various, Loblaws company owns all of these various retail outlets, from, the Loblaws supermarket to No Frills, Joe Fresh, and so they have to see whether or not do they have significant differences between these customer needs that they're trying to serve through these different outlets. Like we mentioned previously, you have to position your product appropriately. H&M versus COS, there needs to be a separate value proposition there. And then finally, you have to communicate and deliver this value proposition, and your marketing mix should support the strategy that you've chosen. For example, Amazon bought Whole Foods, And one of the reasons why they did that is because they wanted the physical retail outlets that Whole Foods already had all over North America. Some of these outlets have been rebranded as Amazon Go stores, where customers can walk in and just walk out without talking to any cashiers. So overall, some summarizing do's and don'ts of consumer market segmentation. Segments should be based on needs and lifestyles. The segment should be attractive in terms of profitability for the company. You have to constantly update your segmenting approach, and you have to invest in emerging segments. Like we talked about in our previous class, there are emerging segments, for example, immigrants who are coming into a country, or, you could have emerging segments, markets that you haven't targeted before but now look appealing. And so in terms of don'ts, don't over-rely on just one method of segmentation. Rely on using a mix of these strategies that we've discussed. Here's a checklist that you can go through when considering your segment. Overall, they come down to whether or not we can effectively target this particular segment or not. You also have to consider the fact that targeting the largest consumer base may not be the most effective segment. Larger customer segments can often be more expensive to access and serve, so that's where you need to understand your company's resources and limits. Smaller customer segments can often be more profitable because you can understand and cater to their needs more effectively. So overall, to recap, 3 steps in target marketing. First, market segmentation, where you divide up the market. The second step is target marketing, where you focus on communicating your value and positioning the product to that segment. And then third is where you develop a marketing mix for that particular market segment. So we will go over some of these ideas next week as well. As for this video lecture, just send me an email to the question that was mentioned earlier in the video. Thank you all for listening, and have a fantastic week, and send me an email if you have any questions. Alright, I'll see you guys next week. Cheers.